Good afternoon and welcome, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Brittany Bevel. I'm the head of guided and gallery-based learning here at the Tampa Museum of Art. Couple of housekeeping things before we get started. First and foremost, everybody please check your cell phones and make sure that they are either on silent or powered off. We greatly appreciate you for doing so. There are a few upcoming lecture programs we wanted you all to be aware of. On October 23rd, we will have an in-gallery lecture about Haitian flags. On November 4th, we will have a virtual program where Bronco will be in conversation about the influence of antiquities on heavy metal. And on November 16th, November 16th, Joanna Robotham, our curator of modern and contemporary art, will be doing an in-gallery program looking at American Impressionism. So we have a busy fall ahead of us. So I hope you all can join us for those. Oh, and at the end of our lecture, thank you, Iris. At the end of our lecture, please stop by the table back here and pick up a survey. Your feedback helps us to continue to improve these programs, as well as seek funding to help sponsor them so we can keep having great speakers like today's. With that, I'm going to invite Dr. Branko van Appen, the Richard E. Perry Curator of Greek and Roman Art, to come up and introduce our program today.
Thank you so much, Brittany. It's really gratifying to see so many people come to our event on a Sunday and also to see a lot of new faces, packed house, so that is absolutely wonderful. I am most grateful for Dr. Sanchita Balachandran for coming down to Tampa. There are board members, committee members here today that I'm very grateful for, staff, friends, incredible. Many of you have a membership at the museum, maybe even have an add-on for the Antiquities Circle. That is for people who are interested in things like this. That add-on membership pays for events like this. So if you like the Antiquities, consider adding that to your membership. If you do not have membership, consider that as well. If you walked in today and paid an entrance ticket, you can use that to complement on your membership. An Antiquities Circle add-on will give you extra information. I can reach out to let you know what is coming up, sometimes months or half a year in advance. There's material for that on the table in the back. So thank you again for coming. And talking about membership, if you already have one with the add-on, maybe you want to send a gift to someone who doesn't, to share the love and share the passion that we all have for the Antiquities. I'm also very grateful for our terrific education team. Brittany Bevel, Iris Gonzalez are here. Staff members, colleagues like Cassandra is here, Sarah Smith is here, Ali, former staff members are here. Rachel, thank you so much. Wonderful to see you all. We have a terrific marketing and communications team that helps us with social media posts, that help us with getting our lectures edited and posting the videos online. Drogida and your team of visitor representatives help events like this go easily. Facilities and security, of course, are also always necessary. So I'm very grateful for all of those. We have a few other announcements after the talk. Please come up to the exhibition in the galleries upstairs about Joseph Veach Noble, because that connects very well with this talk that we will hear later. We just heard from Brittany. We will have a virtual talk in November, which will discuss the reception of ancient mythology in contemporary heavy metal music. So something that may not be for all of you, but it certainly should be something for some of you. Our distinguished speaker today, Dr. Sanchita Balachandran, is the director of the Smithsonian's Museum Conservation Institute. Previously director of the Johns Hopkins Archaeological Museum. She and I first met 8 years ago when we were both at the Getty. She was at the Conservation Institute. And I just recently realized that she also had 2 internships there as an undergraduate and a graduate. She got a PhD from the University of Delaware on preservation studies, if I am correct, an MA at NYU, a BA at Pomona College. She has also extensively excavated in Egypt, India, Cambodia, Tunisia, and North America. She was an associate teaching professor at Johns Hopkins University, where she taught museum practice and technical studies of ancient artifacts, including building her own ancient kiln and working with her students on recreating Attic pottery. The most famous artist of that workshop was known as the Shark Painter, her son. And yesterday she said, that son now has a driver's license. Time just flies by. She has also written amazing articles. They are not intended for an academic public alone. They are accessible, and just listen to this title. A recent article, I haven't read it yet, but it's called Malignant Patina, a Love Story. What if conservators or curators wrote stories rather than condition reports, rather than treatment reports? What stories could they tell with the artifacts that they study? Some of you will know that this is very close to me. She did a study on Roman funerary portraits with her students. She spoke about her role, or a conservator's role, in death life and the afterlife of human remains, about the politics of preservation and museum building, on the aspects of race, diversity, and politics in conservation. Remember, she's at the Smithsonian, about uncovering ancient preparatory drawings on Greek ceramics, which is what she spoke about when we were at the Getty. Look at this beautiful woman and the underdrawings that are still visible on it. The article that really led me to think I need to get her to Tampa is an article about the sensory experiences of ancient Athenian potters when they are firing vases, where she explains that if you walk around an ancient kiln, you can smell and even taste what is happening inside. And that was just so astounding. Apart from, working in the outdoors in Athens in the summer and sweating your bum off. Today, Dr. Sanchita Balachandran is here to speak about ancient Athenian ceramics through the eyes of a conservator. So please give a warm round of applause for the phenomenal Dr. Balachandran.
Branko, maybe I could invite you to talk to my teenagers about how amazing I am. The shark painter would maybe not recognize me. Thank you so much. What a delight to see this many people excited about being in the weeds with a conservator about ancient Athenian ceramics. It is just an absolute pleasure to be here, and just a joy to see Branko again. As he mentioned, the last time we hung out was in a very warm climate with palm trees, and I feel like maybe this is destiny, right? Let's keep that going. But really, I can't believe, first of all, 8 years have gone by, and thank you for your great patience as I figured out how I could come here, but it is just a real joy to be here. And it's wonderful to be able to share this with so many of you. So obviously, since we hung out in Los Angeles, we've both moved places. So Branko, you're so lucky to have Branko here in Tampa, and I've moved to the Smithsonian from Johns Hopkins University. And I just wanted to share very briefly what I'm doing there, because it very much leads on from the work that I was doing at Johns Hopkins. And you may not have heard of the Museum Conservation Institute, but if you've heard of anything related to the Smithsonian, you've probably seen our work. And that's because our job is to preserve cultural heritage. And we do this through 3 main areas: conservation and documentation, scientific research, and also disaster preparedness and response. And on that 3rd point, we've done quite a bit of work here in Florida in response to past hurricanes. But what has been really particularly nice about being here in Tampa is revisiting my more researcher self, because right now I do sit in a lot of meetings, and I do miss the opportunity to just hang out with ancient makers, particularly the makers of ancient ceramics, and that's going to be what I'm going to talk about for most of today. So the title of my talk, Through the Eyes of a Conservator, takes its name from the exhibition that's just upstairs, which I hope you'll come by and visit after we've had this event. And it's this really wonderful exhibition focusing on the work of Joseph Veach Noble and his fantastic collection, which is here in Tampa. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, great. It's really remarkable to see the way that one person's passion has continued to have this incredible legacy in his place. And I was preparing for this presentation. The magnitude of being here in Tampa suddenly struck me. I was coming to Joseph Veach Noble's house. And it was really overwhelming because he has loomed so large in my mind for pretty much 15 years since I started being interested in Athenian ceramics. And when I was in the exhibition upstairs yesterday, there's this large portrait of him, which is up there. And I've seen it many, many times, but it's quite large and it sort of confronts you and he sort of looks at you very evaluatively, like, you know, I know a lot about these pots. I mean, just look at the way he's holding this pot, which I love. So I feel in a special, shall we say, I don't know, I have to prove that legacy is really important and important to keep talking about. But I didn't actually encounter, as I mentioned, Joseph Veach Noble here. By the way, he signed his name Joe Noble, and I can't sort of, I'm still processing that. Joe Noble. It's because he is such a sort of giant in this field. So I actually encountered him for the first time, not in Tampa, but actually in Baltimore. And these are actually pots that you see on display at Johns Hopkins at the Archaeological Museum. If you're ever in Baltimore, please go visit my former, wonderful home. They've actually reinstalled the collection. It looks spectacular. And all the items that you're seeing in these images right now, are actually functional vessels. These are containers that were meant to be used in everyday life. So the really large ones were storage vessels for either wine or olive oil. The really wide open mouth ones are pots for mixing wine with water. And the round shapes that are on the bottom are drinking cups that are tipped up so you can see the images inside them. And I'm sure if you've been to the exhibition upstairs or really seen Athenian ceramics anywhere, you know how incredibly beautifully decorated these are with just a host of scenes from mythology to warfare, religious and athletic activities to glimpses of domestic and daily life. And you have not one, but two experts in the audience, Branko and then Dr. Jeremy Bundrick, who's just here in town and knows, has written just really insightful work on the topic. So I encourage you to talk with them as well. But part of my job at Johns Hopkins was actually to teach undergraduate and graduate students about how ancient objects were made and why understanding the material aspects of these things was important at all, right? And one of the things that's really interesting about working with 18 to 21-year-olds is they ask you a lot of questions. And they say, well, why do you think that way? Why would you do this? This doesn't make any sense. And at first it's a little bracing, but actually I feel like it's really changed the way that I think about this work. And I'm just so grateful for all of that time in the classroom, 13 years of just being stretched and asked to think in really exciting ways. And this is something that actually Noble did for many generations of students. And I actually encountered his book because students were asking me questions like, how were these things made? And this is the book that has literally lived rent-free in my head for a very long time. It was originally published in 1965, but 60 years later still remains one of those go-to books in the field. And you'll see it also in the exhibition upstairs. It's just a picture from the exhibition that shows some of Noble's publications. It's still on sale in the bookshop here, which is also wild. But generations of students and scholars have learned about how pots were made in Athens by reading this book. And in preparing for this talk, I thought I should reread this book, right? What is the staying power that this book has? And first, I think it's really accessible. It's meant to be read. It's not meant to sort of dismiss you for not being an academic, which I think is incredibly important for us to remember. And it's illustrated with lots and lots of photographs, and Noble's background as a photographer really comes through here. You can see he wants people to get things. And he's actually a very interesting thinker. I have to say, I'm still really taken by the fact that he's interested not only in the art history and the culture, but the geology, the clay chemistry, the material science, the art making, even the ethnography, you know, hanging out with contemporary makers, and of course also the conservation and repair of damaged pots. So he was really interested in a lot of things that I myself am also very interested in now. And if you go upstairs, you'll see that he was an early proponent of something we now call experimental archaeology. That is, trying to figure out how past people made things by trying to make them yourself with those same materials or similar materials. And you'll see some of the experiments. There are these wonderful experiments that he did with ancient Egyptian faience on the left, and on the right, these tiles, which I have seen for years in photographs, and it was just kind of wild to see them in person yesterday. You know, just sometimes you have something in your mind and then you encounter them, and it just is kind of mind-boggling. So Noble has really been with me throughout this project. Now, though Noble has been kind of my initial guide through this work, I will admit that there were many moments over the past many years when I was pretty frustrated with his staying power on the subject, because there's some things I really disagree with him on, where the eye of the collector and the eye of the conservator significantly diverge. Now, I've told you that this is through the eyes of a conservator, so let me tell you a little bit about what our work is like. So as conservators, we're responsible for the physical care and preservation of works of art. We're often looking at a combination of scientific techniques and analytical approaches to advance our knowledge of how things were made and what they tell us about the people who made them. And we really study these objects closely because we're interested not only in those objects and the people who made them, but the worlds they inhabited, right? What stories can we tell about these people and their world? And really my most cherished part of this work, the reason why I got into this in the first place, is because you get to handle these objects from the past. And there is just that incredible physical connection between you and someone thousands of years ago who held and used that same item. It is an electric feeling. One thing we're not so good at as conservators is sharing that experience with others. So I'm hoping that if I've done my job over the next 40 minutes, you'll have a way to go into the galleries and begin to see some of the things that I see through the eyes of a conservator. Now, spoiler alert, I've called this through the eyes of a conservator, but I don't want you to just see, as Branko has pointed out, because that puts too much emphasis on just sight, when in fact, as humans, we experience the world in multisensory ways, right? So I'm going to challenge us to think about how we see, smell, touch, hear, and maybe even taste pots. Do not lick the art. It will make everybody very unhappy and I will get in deep trouble. Just, you know, work with me here. Don't lick the art. All right, so when I first met Noble, these were the questions that he had, and these are the questions that I've come to have. If you look at the work that Noble did in this incredible book that continues to resonate with scholars and enthusiasts alike, I think his main question is, how were these pots made? But I would say over the last 10 years or maybe 12 years now, the question that I keep thinking about is, how can we know about the ancient makers' working lives, those people who made these things? And I've said working lives because we can look at these objects for evidence of how they work. It's a little hard to get beyond what else they might have experienced. We can imagine, but what we can actually identify, you have to stay pretty close to the pots. So how are we going to do this? Well, first, let me introduce you to who we're going to be hanging out with, because I'm especially interested in ancient makers. I can't help it. I spend a lot of time with them. I'm so fond of them, and I see the incredible creativity, expertise, and brilliance that they bring to the things they manufacture that we now get to experience in our museums. So the ancient makers who produced these incredible ceramics in Athens around 2,500 years ago are actually a little tricky to hang out with. Our archaeological evidence is still pretty patchy, surprisingly, and it's complicated, and they didn't write about their experiences. And we have a few pictures, if you will, to see them at work, like this one, but even these are a little complicated, right? What we're looking at is a workshop, and there's a big bibliography on this pot. Every pot that I'm going to show you has a bibliography that's like 1,000,000 pages long. Again, I'm going to point to the experts if you want to spend time talking to them about it, but For now, we'll just say this is a workshop. And what we see are 4 people working on pots at seemingly different stages. And there's a woman on the end here. I'll just point this out to you. And my little cursor is not working. Thank you, Bronco. I got to visit with her in Rome when I was lucky to spend 6 weeks at the American Academy in Rome. She happened to be on an exhibition in Rome, and I just felt like, yeah, she came to see me, clearly. So what we're seeing is people working on pots of some kind in this workshop, but what's really happening here? How many goddesses are coming to workshops in the real world, right? So there's things that are very tricky to see. But what I want you to think about is that there's not just one person working on a pot. There are multiple people working on pots in different stages. So I want you to, when we look at all of these pots, think of them as very collaborative surfaces where people come in and out at different stages. We might not be able to tell that they were there, but I promise you they were there if you spend a little more time looking, and I'll try to show that to you. But we have some other interesting evidence because we sometimes think we know who made these pots because they autographed them, which is really, really strange, right? This particular fragmentary wine cup at the Getty claims 2 signatures. One, it says it was potted by someone named Cleophordes, the son of Amasis, and painted by someone named Doris or Doris. So who are these people and why are they signing? Again, 9,000-page bibliography, can't get into it, ask me later. But we actually have a total of 1,040 signatures on the many thousands of pots that are extant, and they raise some really interesting questions. So between the 6th and the 4th centuries BC, approximately, we have these names that suggest people of a range of identities. It's thought that these makers were part of a diverse community comprised of migrant or immigrant workers called medics, Athenian citizens, women, children, freed and enslaved people. So a lot of different people involved in production, but it's hard to pin them down. And some of the signatures on pots tell us about these intriguing identities, though they're really hard to parse, right? Why would you call your name profitable if you're selling pots? It kind of makes sense. Why would you call your name newly acquired? Why would someone sign as the little Syrian or the trustworthy foreigner, or Lydos from Lydia and current-day Turkey, or someone signing to say, I'm Lydos who's enslaved, right? These are some really intriguing things, and I would say that the Greek vase literature has been thinking through these for many centuries, and honestly, I don't know. The honest answer is I don't know if anyone knows, but we have a lot of different ideas about what might be the case. But I'm more interested in what do we know about all of these people beyond these names? So let's start by looking at this particular pot. This pot is attributed to someone called the inscription painter. Now, was there anyone in Athens calling themselves the inscription painter 2,500 years ago? Absolutely not. So in fact, nearly all of the other ancient pots that don't have signatures have been attributed and given names by scholars. And again, it's very hard to get a sense of what were their lives like? How do we actually know anything about these people? But what I'd like to suggest is we can actually use the Conservator's tools to learn a little bit more about what this and other makers' working lives were like. So let's start with this ancient image by starting to get into the sensory world of ancient Athens. So this woman here is standing at a funerary monument where she's about to leave this pot called a lekithos as an offering. And it's pretty delightful that the image of this woman, that she's holding the pot that's basically painted on, which is really lovely. So if we're thinking sensorially, if you're holding this in your hand, right? She's got something else in the other hand, possibly some fruit. If you're holding a pot in your hand, you can see she's sort of grasping it by the foot. And it's a pretty tall and skinny pot, so it's probably a little wobbly in your hand. It's also a container, presumably to hold perfumed oil. So if it's full of liquid and you're holding it in your hand like this, I mean, just imagine the feeling of that, right? Also, if it's got perfumed oil, perhaps you can smell something as you're standing there, who knows? And if you can see the overall image, her companion here is about to put down a musical instrument. So maybe there's some music that's still sort of, hanging in the air. And I did say taste, she is maybe holding that piece of fruit. So fit that taste in there. So now we are here in this very sensorial world. And now let's go find the people who made this pot and the picture associated with it. So I'm going to give you 3 conservation tools that I hope will help you follow ancient makers wherever they are on their work, right? So we'll need to be thinking about 3 things: the structure of the pot, the surface of the pot, and the analysis of the pot. And my hope is that you'll know some of these places to look when you're in the galleries today, or really practically anywhere else from now on, because sometimes just knowing where to start looking is where you'll find yourself sort of in awe. Okay, so let's start with structure. So one way to think about structure in pots is, how does the thing that this woman's holding in this image take that 3-dimensional physical form? What did it take to make that thing stand up, literally in our hand, in our world? And what was the potter's intention for the pot, right? You have to actually have an idea in mind when you're making things. So what was the structure meant to do? And what kind of function was it meant to inform once this thing was sort of created in the world? So for pots, you've probably heard the phrase, and a quote, "throw on a wheel and fire in a kiln." If any of you has ever tried pottery, that is a ludicrous statement. It sounds so easy, but there are so many parts that fit into that very brief description, and it takes years of learning to position your body, to understand your clay, to learn the cadence of the wheel, and a million other things. Now, Noble, interestingly, said, merely to describe the process of making this kind of thing would leave too much to the imagination, so he decided to pose photos, but take them as the potter worked with the wheel in motion. And here he's working with his colleague Feng Chao, who's curator of Far Eastern art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He actually had 2 degrees from Alfred University in ceramics, which is a renowned place for ceramics. And what I really love is there are many, many pages of photographs showing how you actually do the various parts of this work. But had he had access to YouTube, I feel like Noble might have been able to do something pretty extraordinary. And here I'll let you hear from my friend, the Baltimore potter, Matthew Heilich, about how he works. All right, let's see if I can play this without pressing the button. Come on. Okay.
I have no other hobbies. My hobby is my passion and my job.
I'm driving the clay up off the bat, and now I'm elevating.
The master potter doesn't really need to measure. It becomes a muscle memory act, as natural as breathing.
Does anybody want a picture of their object? Cup, object, interesting glob.
All right, so that, I'm not gonna play that again. So that is actually a little clip from a film that Matt and I made from the class that we taught back in 2015. I can't believe it's been 10 years, where we attempted to actually replicate ancient cups from the Johns Hopkins Museum collection. And every time he says, "I have no hobbies," I just crack up. I remind him regularly that he has no hobbies. Doesn't like that. Anyway, like Noble, we conservators often work with artist practitioners because they know and can demonstrate the skills that we want to learn to recognize, even if we can't do them ourselves. And just to show you the things we may or may not be able to do ourselves, contemporary potters are always thinking about how to create the internal volume of pots, right? Building up an internal structure that in turn is going to create that external form. And if you've ever taken a ceramics class, instructors demonstrate this process by throwing this perfectly thin, even thing, and then they just cut it in half and show it to you. And, usually you're stunned into silence. And it's really evidence of how long they've been training their bodies to do this kind of work. And as you can see, there's a real difference from a pot thrown by a specialist on the left and the, shall we say, brutalist profile of a novice's work on the right. And I will neither confirm nor deny that these are my pots. So we can observe this ancient expertise in this very large cup attributed to someone called Epictetus, who has this pot. It's a wine drinking cup that is 16 inches in diameter, and you would be amazed. It's incredibly light and, you know, just wonderful to hold. But such a large open shape is a real challenge to throw, and it's difficult because it keeps slumping on the wheel. And if you just take a look, I think you have a sense of it. The lip of this cup is so perfect. It's basically meant to be sipped from. It's such a beautiful object. So we can get a sense of what it took for someone to actually gain the expertise to make this by looking at a CT scan. So what you're looking at is actually 1,707 cross sections of this pot as the CT scan is going through the pot in profile. And I think you can see just how perfect that profile is. I mean, it astonishes me every time I look at this video, because this person must have been doing this kind of work for years, if not decades, in order to get this to be in such a perfect, I mean, everything is completely symmetrical and beautiful. Now, we also get a sense of how incredibly talented they are when we look at shapes and try to figure out how many parts is that, right? So with a relatively simple shape like this, you might say, oh, well, that's 4 parts. You've got this big, beautiful bowl, you have the 2 handles, and you have the foot. And most potters are thinking about how all of these structural components will fit together, and that in itself is a very challenging process. Trust me, I've tried this. I have no idea how they actually manage this other than years and expertise and brilliance. But it's very hard to tell when you look at things like this. So this is the same pot that you've been looking at. And you could say an educated guess on how many parts this might be is maybe 4. But this is where looking with a slightly different lens, this time in X-ray, brings some pretty exciting stuff to bear. This is actually an image that Noble reproduced in his book, and this is at least 5 parts. This pot, which is meant to be full of this perfumed oil, actually has a little cup inside. So it's just holding a little bit of oil while the rest of the pot's interior is actually hollow. And Noble called this a false-bottomed lekythos. So now if you're holding this pot in your hand, did it get a little bit lighter and a little bit wobblier because it's not as heavy? So he thinks that maybe the potter's tricking someone into believing that it's full of perfumed oil, but did everybody else know that this was the deal? And if you think about it, if you're putting in precious perfume, it wasn't cheap, right? Bronco told me that they recently did some residue analysis on a different lekythos in the collection, and instead of perfumed oil, they found, wait for it, this is a term you won't forget, toad secretion, which is potentially a muscle relaxant, apparently. There you go. That's a lot of toad secretion. So you can understand why maybe you needed a smaller cup. I don't know what that smelled like. I leave that to your imagination. And there's actually a wonderful lekythos, actually by the inscription painter at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where you can actually see that it's broken and you can see this little cup that's in place. So already, just by thinking about structure, we brought into the picture the ideas, the plans that the potters had in mind, perhaps multiple people making different parts of this pot to put it together. And it's taken shape in the world to do a particularly intentional thing that the potter wanted it to do. So now let's go on to surface. So I've told you a little bit, just a little bit, about how these objects were built, but what about the elements that hang on or rest on that structure, and how do those elements draw our attention to the ancient maker's craft? So that was a bit of a trick question, because we actually have to think about what's going on beneath the surface and above the surface, and we'll start just beneath. So Noble believed, and this is a quote from him, that undoubtedly a vase painter evolved some of his compositions, particularly the complicated designs, by making trial sketches before he began working on a vase. So just saying, highlighting this, his and he. None has survived, unfortunately. And he goes on to say, you know, we're unfortunately missing a lot of that preparatory work that artists did. Now, what I'm showing you here is actually work by the shark painter. As Bronco mentioned, when I first started this project, my son was, I think, 6, and he was obsessed with sharks. And we were trying to make replicas of some of these images to test out some of the things that that Noble had said were ways that these objects were made. And I was insisting that he actually do a lot of the drawing for me. 6 and 7-year-olds, they don't really want to be working in a workshop. And at some point he got tired and said, can't you just figure this out yourself? So what I'm showing you are some of the tiles that we prepared. And I don't know if it's easy to see in this light, but if you look at the kind of raking light as it comes in through the window, I think you can see how the tool we were using, in this case a bamboo skewer, it really indents that surface of the clay because the clay is still damp and pliable. And if you pushed into it, you would actually damage the surface. So you have to think about these surfaces, including, you know, these pots that had just been thrown, as still being indentable, particularly with a drawing tool. So how do we see this on ancient pots? So let's start with this one. This is a tiny little fragment that's actually from the Getty collection, and it depicts obviously a cute little ancient dog. And let's compare what's visible with just our eyes on the top surface and what we can see when we utilize a technique called reflectance transformation imaging. So this is a way to take images, multiple images from different angles across a surface, and then you can use an open source software that lets us play with the movement of the light. And if I play this again, you can see, does it work? No. Sorry, left hand pressing buttons, challenging. Okay, if you follow the little light that's on the green button here, that's the direction that the light is coming from. And when you see the cursor go over to something that's called specular reflectance, it's taking all of the color out of the image so you can really concentrate on the differences in the surface that suddenly pop up. So this dog is not a particularly complicated image to draw. Well, I mean, for me it is, but certainly wasn't for this person that we call the Brighouse painter. But what we see actually is that underneath this relatively simple painting is actually quite a lot of drawing or sketching. And what we're actually seeing is the thinking work of this artist, trying to figure out how skinny or well-fed is this dog, right? What feels right? And one more tricky thing I have to tell you. So I think at this point you understand that the drawing lines are made by indenting the surface with some sort of tool. The painted lines are actually painted not with paint, but something called slip. So slip is a thinned and processed clay. It contains quite a bit of iron, and it's essentially the result of this iron and the way that it will be fired later on that makes these surfaces red and black. So more on that in a minute. But I think you can see that there's actually a lot going on under the surface. And if you can actually track the drawings, you see there are a lot of marks to figure out what kind of dog, what feeling do I want for this dog? And I just find this kind of thinking really exhilarating. And recent cognitive science research on drawing really says that drawing is a multi-sensory discovery tool. It's not just doodling. It's not just, you know, you're bored. It is a way that we figure out things so that we can actually we can arrive at what we want to depict or talk about or show. Another example, also by this person we call the Brighouse painter, is this other fragment from the Getty. And here you can see very clearly that tool, how much it pressed into the surface. And here you can see he's playing, or see what happens? This person is playing with how is this arm going to be extended? Is it like this? Is it like this? And it's really exciting to see those changes. And the literature has unfortunately sometimes thought of these as mistakes. They're not. They're actually someone figuring something out on the surface that we can still access today. We can hang out with them as they're figuring this out, which I find just, you know, one of the most humbling things ever. So I've shown you fragments. How does this work on a pot? And the two fragments I've shown you were convex. This is a concave surface. So this is going to take a slightly different way of holding something while you're drawing this. This is probably my second favorite pot ever created. This is a wonderful object that is attributed to Doris, who may be a male person or a female person. We don't know, but this person has at least 52 signed items that you can find in museums worldwide. And this is an image that depicts two figures striding into battle. Again, huge bibliography, probably Amazon's warrior women, but huge bibliography. So this is a wine cup. And if you look at the RTI, the reflectance transformation imaging of this, oops, no. you'll start to see something pretty exciting. So this is a really complicated design relative to the ones that we've seen. And I think you can start to see, for example, the entire profile of this figure has been drawn in underneath the shield. So it was never planned to be actually painted in, but it was clearly put there so that the sort of orientation and the perspective could be figured out. But there are so many little changes here, trying to figure out where the arms would be, where the legs would go. And this is one of my favorite little details. I don't know if you can see it in this light. And I'll show it to you. Watch what happens here. There are some little tiny curls that were drawn in under the helmet. The curls were never going to be shown, right? They're covered by the helmet. But I mean, when you see these sorts of things, it just makes you go, oh, I'm so lucky to do this. So we've talked a little bit about what you can see under the surface. But what can you see then just above the surface? So we've done the drawing. The surfaces are indented a little bit to give a sense of what the picture is going to be. And then you need to paint in all of this decoration while the pot typically is still damp, though always more complicated than that, and before it's ready to be fired in a kiln. And remember, the painting is not with paint, well, not always, mostly it's complicated. In this instance, we're going to talk mostly about painting with slip, which is again this processed and thinned clay that contains iron that will change colors magically in the kiln. Okay, so how did people paint with slip? So Noble's comment is the ancient paintbrush very closely resembled those in use today. Okay, and we have again some pictures that show us people with paintbrushes. You've already seen the image on the left, and on the right, I think you can see that there's this person holding a giant pot against his legs, which I just really love that sort of intimacy. It reminds me also of Noble's portrait, and is working with this brush. And this is a fantastic object at the Ashmolean, which I got the chance to image some years ago. And here's a detail of that scene. So what you're seeing, first of all, this is a giant brush, right? This is someone holding the brush like this. And now that you're used to seeing all these drawn lines, I think you can see the lines for the hands. And there's actually lines for the paintbrush. And these little wispy bits that show you what the brushy bits would have been like, which I mean, it's just so lovely. So, okay, you could argue this is like the brush we use today. But this object has confounded a lot of people. Again, bibliography. I'll just start saying bibliography. You'll know what I mean. This is a really amazing object that is currently at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, which I also got a chance to image. And if we look at the RTI of this, it doesn't help us a lot, right? This person seems to be painting the underside of this cup, and there's this weird wispy thing. What is this wispy thing that has a little line right here? And then there's this other thing that this person may be holding in his hand. It's the thing that launched 1,000 articles, bibliography. But here's what my question is. So how do we know what all these brushes are? So in order to do that, I ended up working with a contemporary brush maker who's also a ceramics scholar or ceramics artist. And we looked at archaeological evidence for animals in ancient Athens to come up with some of the usual suspects for making brushes, because brush hairs come from someone, right? So these are the ones that he recommended based on the types of lines that we see on ancient Athenian pots. So you can see goat, especially, again, you've heard of toad secretion. Now you will never unhear this. Goat chest hair is really great for brushes. I can confirm, it's amazing. So goat, ringtail cat. There are no ringtail cats in the Mediterranean, but they're sort of weaselly type creatures who would fit. Squirrel. We tried horse, stone marten, also a little sort of weaselly, groundhog, and woodchuck. And I have to say, some of these were obviously not going to work well with slip. And others, you know, you really had to choose whether you wanted a certain type of mark, or depending on how drippy your slip was, you might choose one over the other. So there are a lot of calculations in what kind of brush you might choose. So from working with Joe Campbell, who built us these brushes, one of the things that became clear is there's a brush that looks a certain way when it's dry, And then when it gets wet, it looks different and it paints very differently. And that was the case for the ringtail cat, which you can see is quite fluffy when it's dry, but when it's wet with slip, actually draws this incredibly fine line, and you can actually make very long marks with it. I mean, it's beautiful. I can't make the marks similar to what we see on Athenian pots, and even Joe, who's been a ceramicist and an instructor for 50 years, said, I can make a brush that makes that line, but I can't make that line with that brush. So it tells you how incredibly talented and well-practiced these people were. So this leads me to ask, okay, so how many brushes might have been part of the ancient artist toolkits? And where and whom did these brushes come from? We might never know this answer. These sorts of things don't survive the archaeological record, but even asking that question opens up a lot of inquiry into who's around, where are they finding these creatures? Are they trading with people? Was goat chest hair really the thing at the time? I mean, we can't answer these necessarily, but it just makes us think about, again, this very sensory and very embodied world that they obviously lived in. Oh, and I just want to show you, oops, sorry. The ringtail cat is literally ringtail of a cat. It's a tail. It was kind of surprising to me when we started working with this. That's what they are. So this makes me bring us back to this image, and this is the specular reflectance image. So the image with the light, the color taken out. And I think you can start to see how many different kinds of brush marks there are, right? So how many brushes did you need to make all of these different marks? For example, the little teeny tiny dots, for example, that's a very different brush than perhaps some of these wider areas that are filled in, right? And it also makes you think about the shape of the brush, because if you want to make those teeny tiny dots, you're not using that same brush for these wider areas. So what are they using, and are there different people who were responsible for different parts of these decorations? And if we put the color back in, you'll see there are even more areas that pop up where you realize there are even more brushes, or brush marks at least, that were present on the surface. And again, leads us to ask how many people were actually working on pots at once? All right, so we've built a structure, we've done the drawing, we've painted an image, but you've still got a pot that will turn to mush if it gets wet, or will basically get broken if you press it, you drop it or you press it too hard. So the final part of the process is actually firing it into kind of an indelible surface, that ceramic that's actually going to be able to contain a vessel, or that toad secretion. I'm just going to keep saying it because toad secretion is my new favorite thing. This is just to show you that in the 60 years that Noble did his work, and what is really remarkable from looking at some of the work that he published in this book, he was interested in a lot of the kinds of material science questions that we are fascinated by still today. If you look at his book, he's interested in, how do we characterize the clays that these objects are made from? How do we understand the different layers that are on pot surfaces? He publishes microscopy images. It's really remarkable, his interest, and probably he would be astonished by the kinds of things that we can see today with the technology that we currently have. So you've already seen some of this. I mean, obviously he had x-rays, but you've seen some CT scans, you've seen some reflectance transformation imaging, but now we have, just to give you a sense of it, X-ray fluorescence, X-ray diffraction, which they had at the time, and he tried to utilize Raman spectroscopy, particle-induced X-ray emission spectroscopy, X-ray absorption near-edge structure spectroscopy. There's a lot of different things that we have available, and transmission electron microscopy, all of which have been used to actually understand how these pots were made. And I'm just showing you some really amazing work that's been done at the Getty, in the Getty Athenian Pottery Project, where they've actually been able to tell you what colors are present on these pots. And as I mentioned, these are all iron-containing compounds, and what you see is that the different colors on these pots are different iron compounds that are created as a result of heat and environment. I'm sure Noble would have loved to see this thing. So how do we think about this work? So here are some areas where we really disagree. So first of all, you'll see these upstairs. These are these incredible replicas that he made, not that different, obviously, from the the plaques that you saw us making. And here you see the before on the left and the after firing on the right. Right? And you can still visit them upstairs, which is really wonderful. So this is the process that he identified in his book, and I've just made a little easy graphic. And you're all here to hear about Athenian ceramics, so we are about to get in the weeds, all right? So you've made your clay pot, you've made that structure, you've painted it with slip in whatever way, and now you know there's a drawing step in between, and then you're gonna put it inside a kiln. The way that usually it's described is first the temperature is raised from room temperature all the way to over 900 degrees centigrade in the presence of oxygen. At this point, everything on your pot is going to be red because the iron oxides at the time on the pot, because of the presence of oxygen, create these red iron compounds. Then you lower the temperature, or excuse me, you close the kiln somewhere between 800 and 900 degrees centigrade. That was his number. And you close it to remove oxygen and everything turns black. And at this point, everything that is reacting inside the kiln is turning into these black iron compounds because you no longer have oxygen circulating. Then at some point you reopen the kiln and suddenly only some areas actually turn back to being red. And these are the areas that actually haven't been painted with slip. And that is because there's a very thin layer of glass that should have been created over those areas painted with slip that stops oxygen from diffusing into them and turning them back to red. So then, you know, that's it, you're done. You basically wait until it cools, you open it up, and you've got your perfect pot. This is the simplified version. All right, I have more diagrams if you're interested. But my biggest problem with this, and I think most scholars' biggest problem with Noble's work on this, is he did all this work in an electric kiln, right? Obviously, he knew that that wasn't appropriate for ancient Athens. But if you really want to think about this, you have to build a kiln, right? So we did. And let's see if I can play it. No, I don't know what I just did. This is what happens when you're not. There we go. We come back. Excellent.
Shoot. Is this extended enough?
We could certainly have a 10-inch extension ready.
Yeah, let them paddle. We need some paddlers. You're gonna do this. Oh my gosh, I can't believe this stuff is so good.
I'm a junior in material science, and I'm happy to kind of be the resident material science student. You know, try to offer whatever limited insight I have in my own field that I'm learning to this class. That's 1.5. We need another full inch. There's only so much that discussion can bring up. All these parameters that you would have no idea, you would just assume a kiln is a kiln. In your mind, you can picture a kiln. When you actually have to make one, like so many, you appreciate the art a lot more.
I'm a freshman, so I'm new to college, and I didn't really expect anything like this.
Before we go any higher, let's get some dirt back in there.
To pick up a cup and imagine what it's going to look like, and like, I mean, our kiln is actually happening, and it's wonderful, and it's really rewarding, more so than you would imagine. I mean, I don't like shoveling, but I'm doing it, and it's really fun here.
Okay. So here is what our wonderful little kiln looks like. It survived 12 firings, which was the intention, and we made over 1,200 substandard Athenian pots in that. No fault of maths, but it just really emphasized how very hard and challenging this work is to do. And this is based on archaeological examples, and we had Eleni Hasaki, who's really one of the experts in this field, come out and visit our kiln. But it really shows the value of combining that archaeological evidence, the people who actually know how to build kilns, and of course, student labor. So here's another way of looking at that production process that we actually can confirm from experiments that we ran. So when things are inside a kiln, you can't see anything that's going on inside. We have some pictures from antiquity that show little spy holes where you could have maybe reached in with a long rod and pulled something out and thrown it on the ground to see what color you were creating. But for the most part, you don't know what's happening inside the kiln. So you have to actually rely on a lot of other things that give you clues that you're doing the right thing. What you're seeing here, this is actually the analysis of one firing that we did actually in November of 2016. And what you're seeing from these different lines are the different shelves of our kiln, which tell you that there's slightly different temperatures being reached at all of these different shelves of our kiln. It was a multi-hour firing process. You can see us going basically from room temperature. And then at its height, we were at about 900 and actually a little bit close to 1,000 degrees, slightly over. And that first phase is called oxidation, right? We have all this oxygen and we're producing all those nice red iron oxides. At about 1,000 degrees, we closed all of the ports of the kiln and we put the kiln into reduction. So all the oxygen is being sucked out of the kiln and hopefully we're producing just those black iron oxides on every surface of all the pots inside the kiln. And then after about 45 minutes of that, we re-oxidized. We reopened some of those ports. And again, you have a thin layer of glass that has been created just on those areas that were painted, and everything else that wasn't painted goes back rather magically to being red. Now I can describe it to you, I can show you graphs, but it's really better that you watch it.
Right now we're just trying to identify what can it do. Once we get to temperature, we will seal the air ports. We'll fill the firebox with kindling, and that starts the heavy reduction cycle.
Matt,
I've
we're at
gotta
940. We're at 940.
Push those boards in a little bit. Yeah. All right, so let's get ready to seal up the mouse holes.
Get it going. There.
All right, step back. Can you see?
You all right?
We're not as concerned anymore with what the temperature is inside. We're concerned about what the atmosphere is, and that is smoky and smoldering.
This is the part where hopefully things are going black.
We'll open back.
So that was the shark painter way in the background. I was holding my daughter who's now 12 and thinks this is so weird. Why do we do these things? Anyway, no students were harmed in the production of this video. So what I want to say is it's a very visceral experience, right? You know what's happening because all of these other sensory cues other than sight of the objects themselves are telling you what needs to happen next. So the idea that, it's relatively simple and it could be figured out using an electric process, I think doesn't quite hold true. The other quibble I have with Noble is his repeating of this phrase that Attic potters used only one firing cycle. And this is something that has kind of stuck around in the literature for a long time, this idea that everything was done perfectly once, and that is somehow the thing we seek to attain. To be honest, the thing you seek to attain if you're a potter in ancient Athens is to sell a beautiful pot that someone wants to buy, or a pot of any kind that someone wants to buy. So it doesn't entirely matter if you produce it in one firing, or two, or three, or four, because we've done all of them, and you can't always tell the difference between whether something was fired once, twice, three times, or four times. And so it makes me wonder about all these beautiful pots that we have in our museum collections where we've been telling the story that this was a perfect thing that happened once, but actually it was probably someone who was, sometimes fixing mistakes, because this is really a difficult process and it's hard to get right because there's so much you can't control. So just as an example, I want to show you one pot, and this is a test pot that was sent to us from Eleni Aloupi from Athens, who does actually reproductions of these types of objects for museum collections. And she's a chemist. She's just been a really fantastic person to talk with about this process. And she wanted us to test some of the pots that she painted. Way better painting than the shark painter, which was me. So we put this particular pot into a kiln. And in this case, the highest temperature we could achieve was 918 degrees Celsius, excuse me. So it actually wasn't high enough to hit those deep black iron oxides that we wanted to produce. So when it came out, as you see on the bottom, it's not what we wanted. So most potters know, that you can actually refire things if you know what you're doing. And this was the second firing, where we returned that same pot into the kiln. We hit the temperature that we wanted. We put it actually in a different location in the kiln where we knew it would reach that temperature. And voila, it looks the way that we intended. So thinking about Noble's original idea, it's a much more complicated diagram than I think he drew. And this is as complicated as I could draw it. There are other scenarios, but I literally couldn't figure out how to do more arrows. But I want to suggest that these are people who are dealing with challenging circumstances. There are a lot of things out of their control. They're incredibly creative. They're resilient. They're figuring out how to make things work. And they're very realistic, right? Like, okay, this is what I have, what can I do? But at the same time, incredible, artistic geniuses. So this idea that we can sort of imagine a very simple diagram, it really is something that I can't accept anymore. So why does any of this matter? As you've seen, my children have grown up throughout this process, perhaps asking me these questions a couple times. But really, why does this matter? What have we learned? And why do we keep doing this, right? So one of the things I want to first acknowledge is the beauty of doing work like this is you don't do it alone. The fact that I can share this with you is kind of my dumb luck. There are a lot of people who absolutely transform my understanding of this material, who just gave of themselves freely. And I think, and especially my students over many years, and I have to say one of the funnest parts of this is that there's some of these students who still write to me and say, I went to a museum and I bored my parents, or bored my girlfriend telling her about how these things were made. What more do you want as an educator, right? But really, I want to acknowledge that the kind of work that we do is the most interesting, most curious when we work with a lot of people outside of our usual collaborators, because they really stretch us and they force us to ask those questions that perhaps we never even thought to ask. But in terms of other reasons why we might want to do this work, you might say, why do we want to focus on art when we could be working on something more useful like science or engineering? And I hope that this brief introduction has shown you that there is plenty of science and engineering in the ancient world. And there are ways that we can enter into that world that, are quite transformative, right? They're not just about the art and the history. They're also about that kind of technical genius and ingenuity and innovation. Another thing that for me is particularly important is stories that we can tell about the past. I feel like we spend a lot of time assuming that we know everything we can know, or that there's some things we can't know anything about, so the work is finished. And I think what is so exciting to me about this kind of interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary work is that they're stories that we can get curious about because we've never asked them the same way. And there are other things that become available to us, some of the technical studies, for example, the analytical work, but also just the questions that push us forward. And I think for me, ultimately as a conservator, but also, as a sort of thinking fleshy human being, is to really think about the fact that these are also human beings, right? They're incredibly creative, thoughtful, artistic people who are they're making incredible things that tell their own stories. And if we're willing to spend a bit more time with them, search for them in the places where they're easiest to be found, that connection between the past and the present, but I would say also the present and the future remains open. So thank you so much for your attention.
This is amazing. I'm so pleased to have you here. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. We'll do 15 minutes or so. We also want to go upstairs, especially for those of you who haven't seen the exhibition of Joseph Veach Noble. There's already a hand in the back there.
Easy question. Were you guys used in a wood kiln?
Yes.
Great. It's so small.
Pretty standard size, actually, from what we understand. Yeah.
Barbara.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating.
Thank you.
Could you talk at all about the women in the workshop again?
Actually, Jeremy Bundrick and I were just talking about how hard it is to talk about the presence of women in the workshop. So we have at least 3 images of women producing ceramics. And we don't have that many actually images of women, of people producing ceramics. I think a total of 18 or 20. So to have women in 3 of them is actually, you know, they're clearly there. And I think there's been an assumption that they're around, that they're participating. But if you look at the literature, it's always, you know, he, his, it's kind of impossible to get away from that. And even an image like this one that you see here, where there's this woman working on a pot in the corner, some of the interpretations of that have been, well, she's kind of shoved in the corner, you know, they ran out of space and they thought they should put a figure in. I mean, there's some very strange arguments about how they're depicted. Some of the arguments include things like, well, we know women were involved, but they probably weren't working in the actual ceramics making because clay is heavy. That one really threw me, you know, because these are people who do agricultural labor. They're doing all kinds of other labor. So the idea that clay was heavy really makes no sense to me.
And there are no modern female potters, of course.
Right. And we have archaeological evidence actually of at least one Greek woman who seems to have been a potter making quite large ceramics, but even that has been debated. So to me, the question is, why are we so insistent that we don't recognize this really big group of people that were participating in production? Just because we can't pinpoint exactly the person, and you know, the fact that they were there doesn't mean that they weren't present. And even the name of the artist named Doris/Doris, our colleague David Saunders at the Getty has said, well, I mean, that's a name that could go, you know, either be a man's name or a woman's name. So there are a lot of questions that are open. And to me, it's the kind of key aspect of this work is how do we open up the idea that there are multiple people working on these very collaborative surfaces. We can't always identify who's participating in what part of it, but we have to at least acknowledge that they're there.
Michelle.
Thank you.
One of the reasons is because there aren't a lot of people. I'm in my 3rd decade, over 30 years as a full-time potter. There aren't a lot of people like you sharing this. I've been to hundreds of workshops and talks. I've never had anyone that acted like an 18-year-old in their first year of college excited. And I don't, of course, you know a lot more than 18 people, but your exuberance is contagious.
Thank you.
With women, I'm in a creatives group, and our homework this month, ironically, was my question is, how do we represent the woman right now? I'm a hand painter on my yellow hat. I want to pick your brain outside where you leave to find, you know, sources that, because I know you have them.
And the first one I would say to everyone, and what's amazing about the Getty is they put a lot of their publications online for free. I mean, full PDFs. And the kind of, to me, the most amazing follow-up to this book is Toby Schreiber's book. She's a potter. She unfortunately passed away last year or the year before that. Just an incredible potter who actually looked through the Getty collection and went object and by object and described how she as a potter would interpret it. And that's, you know, and she was a real visionary. It was really humbling to meet her some years ago. So I would point you to that.
Yeah, I want to thank you. I learned so much from your talk.
Thank you.
Absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.
My questions, okay. I studied pots with Mary Moore years ago. And I remember her saying that the potter was often more important than the painter. And I saw how difficult it was to create. If a vase is signed by a potter, now I'm thinking it may be collaborative. Or does that mean that potter did all the 4 or 5 sections? And the same with the painters. If it's signed by a painter, Doros, the Achilles painter, whatever, well, Achilles painter didn't sign his name quite that way. But in any case, do we assume that the painter just did the major zone and other people did the secondary?
Okay, so the question was, if I can paraphrase, how do we understand the work of the potter and the painter relative to each other? And how can we understand the sort of maybe hierarchy, right? Who's more important and who's not? Again, bibliography can give you a lot of arguments about this, and I don't think we know, right? And to me, one of the questions is, you know, how would we find this out? Because we might not ever know. And it also has to do with the fact that some of the archaeological evidence, and this is work by Vladimir Stisi, actually from the Netherlands, where he's been saying, you know, if we look at the archaeological evidence for these ceramic studios, these potters' workshops, there are no walls, right? There are basically these kind of open areas where people are kind of reconfiguring maybe these workshops to suit the commission or to suit whatever work they're doing. So I really like this idea that people are kind of coming in and out of working with each other. We have some examples where potters and painters sign together over and over again. There's some people who are thought to have really worked together a lot of the time. But who are those people? I don't know. And I think I'm really curious about how, and this is the other thing, people talk a lot about the competition in the ancient Potter's Quarter. And I'm sure there was competition, right? But I'm also really curious. These are people who are seeing each other all the time. They know each other's work. They have to collaborate on some of these things like firings. So what was that like? What were those experiences like? Did people really hate each other and go, oh, the Berlin painter, God, he's so good at what he does. I can't stand him. But Doris, she's amazing. I don't know. I would love to know what those conversations were like, but I think it's still very much an open question. And I question whether we'll ever be able to find out, you know, what is the hierarchy, who did what, but I can tell you that a lot of pots that I see, we see evidence of a lot of collaboration, but, you know, maybe a major part of the painting is done by one person, but certain parts are added. It's hard to know. It sort of varies from pot to pot.
Thank you.
Bob had a question.
An observation maybe, and then a question. In terms of your experiment that did not get the temperature raised high enough on the first firing, might that also be a factor of the type of wood you're using? Because my estimation is the harder the wood, the higher the temperature. And we've seen that in Egypt, where they could not make glass because the wood they had was just soft. When they started to import cedar from Lebanon, they could go from faience to glass because they could get a higher temperature. So might that be a factor?
So I think for us, the main factors were a few different ones. Some is the temperature outside the kiln. So we were firing in a range of, and you know, snow, rain, I mean, really windy. And depending on the day, if it was really windy, that firing would be done in 5 hours. And if it was nice and dry, we could hit the temperature really quickly. If it was wet, or we fired in snow twice, why did we do that? It took forever. It was miserable. And there were certain areas we could tell from the indicators that we had inside the kiln that we weren't getting it hot enough. So that was part of it. Another part of it is these are, they're different shelves, right, within a kiln. And if you look at some of we have one picture, an ancient picture, not from Athens, but from Corinth, that shows a stacked kiln. And there's just all this stuff kind of shoved into this little space. And if you've ever done kiln stacking, right, it's this amazing jigsaw puzzle. So depending on where you are relative to the fire, you're obviously going to get to different temperatures. So we also noticed that when we put clay that we didn't know well into a different shelf, we didn't hit the temperature that clay needed. So part of it was also learning the clay and learning where on the shelf we had to put it in order to get the colorant that we wanted. But we only learned that by trial and error. Now in ancient Athens, probably they knew this clay incredibly well. They knew what places were going to work the best, but you still can't control the environment. And I doubt if, I mean, my sense is it wouldn't have been as much the wood as all of the other environmental factors, but I don't know.
So you were, in any given fire, multiple vessels were being fired.
Yep.
The second question then is, were you using any kind of kiln furniture, or was the pot just coming in contact with the shelf?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And there's a picture of kiln furniture in my presentation, and there's a little bit of kiln furniture in the exhibition upstairs, which we should look at. Sure, there was kiln furniture, But these are not glazed pots, so you're not as worried about the fact that something is going to get vitrified and stick to the next thing. So we were actually stacking things one on top of another, or sometimes one thing inside another, because you could protect areas that you didn't want to change quite so much. It's kind of a magical jigsaw puzzle. So we use some, but oftentimes, you know what we use for kiln furniture, which, Matt, the potter, did in his normal work, broken pots that didn't work from the last time. So at least they had some use, even though it felt really sad.
Sure.
Oh, sorry.
So as you were talking, I'm writing on my hand with my very important notes here, but going all the way back to your kind of first slide, you showed that pot that had the white repair being done. I guess, the pot, right?
Yes.
And it really fascinated me, like, how do you do that? And then what's that material? And then when it's done, are you repainting it, refiring it? I mean, when I'm looking at that pot here, there, or someplace else, is it actually, are many of them already repaired pots?
So when we go upstairs to the gallery, please look for evidence of repairs, because these are amazingly resilient surfaces, but a lot of them will show evidence of not only modern repair, but some ancient repairs, which are also really extraordinary to find. Let's see if I can find that picture.
Sorry for sending you back.
No, it's fine. So here it is. Okay. So there it is.
There, that guy.
Okay, here we are.
That's what you're asking about, right, Phil?
Right.
This is also
when you start looking at pots, you'll notice that a fair amount of them have probably been in some way repaired for the art market, right?
So they don't resand them and
they do all kinds of things to them.
Which is why they look so perfect upstairs.
And sometimes you have pots, fragments that don't go together, that have actually been made to fit into the same pot. So in this particular instance, this is that very large pot, that the wine cup attributed to Epictetus, and you can see a couple behind. The reason why we were conserving them in preparation for an exhibition at the Johns Hopkins Archaeological Museum is because we had actually found that people had painted over the repairs and painted over the original pots, and in some cases obscured some of the signatures that we had on some of our pots. So really it was a decision to kind of scale back some of these old repairs so you could see more of the original. As for the white stuff that's there, so sometimes you can take a pot apart and put it back together, especially if it's been glued with adhesives that are damaging to the ceramic. In this case, you can see how many pieces are on this pot, and we just did not want to take that apart. But what we did do was actually improve the fill material in all the areas where there are big gaps. And that's an acrylic fill material that is then painted with acrylic paints. And so if you, I think as a casual observer, but certainly as a conservator, were to look at this, you could easily tell where the repairs were and where the ancient surfaces are.
Another question, as you were showing things, you said, oh, and that's some Brazilian women or something to that effect. And my question is, you're in Athens, how do you know what a Brazilian warrior looks like?
An Amazon.
Amazon. So
not from the forest.
Know that. If you're in Athens.
Oh no,
making the pot.
Oh no, the mythological warrior women, the Amazons from Greek mythology.
Okay.
Yeah, so different Amazon, but good question.
And then the brushes. You found all kinds of things over the years. Have we found any brushes?
No, we've not.
It's organic.
So do we know that?
They don't survive the archaeological record. They just are completely gone. And we actually don't have very many of the tools. We found these sort of metal, sort of leaded sticks that actually may be more related to sculpture. But in terms of ceramics manufacture, the tools that we have very few. We just have these pictures, which leaves it really open.
Maybe one or two.
How did you track, not you, how did you track temperatures back then? I mean, you have a little digital thing and it says 980 degrees, God bless you. But first question is, how do you do that, right? And then the second question is, okay, well, you did it here, but those guys over there, they didn't have YouTube videos, so how do you transmit that information between sites?
So there's actually a fair amount of literature on this, and some people have thought that there were different metals that were put into the kiln that would melt at certain temperatures, so you could tell where you were and you could see it through the little spy window. But if you look at archaeological excavations like at the Athenian Agora, there are lots of little test pieces. So they're broken fragments that have little holes in them that would have been put close to that little spy hole. So as you're thinking, oh, is it getting close to 900 degrees or what, obviously they weren't thinking in 900 degrees. They were thinking, I'm getting close to, it's time for this stuff to turn black. You could have put a metal stick in, hooked that piece out through the spyglass and thrown it on the ground and went, oh yeah, no, it's still red. We're not there yet. So there are other ways in which people were obviously kind of measuring the temperature without measuring the temperature.
I'd just like to add my comments to everybody else. It was just a phenomenal,
thank
really,
you.
maybe my favorite one that I've seen here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bill, maybe one more question
One of the
after.
things we see in the collection is that Joe Noble was fascinated with mistakes.
Yeah.
And if you can refire and correct them, why weren't those refired?
Okay, so he actually says in the book, I do wonder about whether we might refire some of these mistakes now, right? And so I don't, as a conservator, I wouldn't recommend that.
No,
But
Bill's question is,
why didn't they refire and fix it?
Back then?
Yes.
Well, I mean, who knows? But I would think, first of all, they're different markets, right? Like you might just be going to sell something that's pretty decent, or you're trying to make a spectacular thing that has to be perfect. So there's a range of things that would still sell. So part of it is probably a calculation, like, do I really want this to be, 20% better, or is this gonna still work? I think there's also, to me, the question of what did they live with? Because even some of the most spectacular pots, they still have these kind of firing, if you want to call them mistakes. They're just, the challenges of making these sorts of things. So I think in some ways our eyes have been very much biased by the kinds of collections we're around, which are perfect. But if you go see most archaeological collections, you'll see every kind of variety of thing. And I do wonder, right? Some of the kind of most famous perfect pots, how much did it take to get to that level of just absolute perfection?
Yeah.
And how much did those people know how to get it to that
because it's another
level?
3 days of work.
Yeah,
to
it's 3
refire
days,
it.
it's more wood, go ahead.
And is there any evidence that any of them are refired? Can you see that
Yes.
in some way?
So the Getty published actually an article looking at the firings of 2 different pots associated with probably 2 of the most famous Athenian potters and painters we know. And what they can see from some of this analytical work is some of these, at least one particular pot was definitely fired twice.
In your scheme, you also had the inscriptions that are added.
Yep.
And one of the things why she's here is when she was at the Getty, she was asking these questions like, why are the inscriptions less black than the rest of the black? That's because they were added and then they were put back into the kiln. Scott, did you have a question?
Yeah, Bill did.
I
was just going to say that it was definitely an economic consideration, because to refire must cost. And you correctly said, at least to my way of thinking, that there's a market out there. So you know how much the pot is going to get for you, no matter how it's fired, if it's perfectly fired. And then you have to evaluate, well, what's the cost of the wood? What's the cost of the space that I've got to take up in the kiln? And yeah, fascinating. Thank you for your lecture, by the way.
One more round of applause. And I would love to invite you all to go upstairs to the Noble exhibition. You can take the green elevator right here or the steps. And if you're tired about ancient art, we also have 2 exhibitions. Brittany is reminding me of something. Grab a survey, fill it out, because we want to know why you're here and what we're doing well. And we also want to learn what we're not doing well. So any thoughts you have that you could share, fill out the survey. Otherwise, I'll be upstairs with Sanchita. And thank you again for coming. I really appreciate seeing you on the Sunday.